Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Dawn Campbell, your host, one of the directors at the IAPC&M, and today in the hot seat we have Michael Marx. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for the invite. I'm so glad to be here.
You're very welcome. Now, I know it's early in the morning for you, and you said it's snowing outside, which I know are the perfect temperatures and climate for you. Today, we're going to be talking about suicide prevention and intervention. And it doesn't have to be a really somber subject either. So Michael is going to be talking us through how to help clients when we recognize or intuitively feel that something isn't quite right. Before I hand over to Michael, I just wanted to pick up on the snow mentioned earlier. Michael's passion is sledging with dogs. So that's his other business that he and his wife have. I think you've got something like 25 dogs. Is that right, Michael?
Oh, no, just 21. It's a small team.
21, small team. And it's a wonderful hobby and keeps you very fit. So that's wonderful. So without further ado, this is about an hour-long call with questions. Where would you like the questions, Michael? At the end or as we go? What's your preference?
As we go is fine. That'll be fine.
Okay. All right. So if everybody would like to say what their questions are in the chat box, I'll make sure nothing's missed. So over to you, Michael, please.
Okay. Well, my background in suicide intervention is, how would you say, from a servant's position. I have not experienced anything in my immediate family, my immediate circle of friends. In the ICF community, the International Coaching Federation, back in 2017, I was leading the community of practice for ethics. And in ethics, we've always told coaches, well, if the client says suicide, you have to do something. And I realized we've never told them what to do. So we put together a presentation in April, and it has turned into a nonprofit organization for me. I have a team of about 20 people. We're meeting this evening to learn even more about how to intervene in suicide situations. So my main emphasis is on the intervention. The prevention is an aspect of mental health and wellness. Basically, the more stable the person is, the more or less likely they are to complete a suicide. And when I say complete a suicide, I recognize already that that's a funky word. We use kind of strange vocabulary. To complete a suicide, somebody that is in the circle of the person that attempted suicide is a survivor. So you'll hear me using words like that. We stay away from the word commit nowadays, because that has connotations like commit a crime or commit a sin, and we don't regard that as a crime. I've noticed some people here from Ireland. Information that I have was that until 1994, it was regarded as a crime in Ireland. And so it's really recent that we've had this awareness that suicide is normal part of life, yes, but also very preventable. Dr. Paul Quinet says it is the most common form of violent death and the most preventable. So what I'm hoping to achieve today in today's call is talk to you folks who I understand are mostly professionals like myself, coaches in whatever form that is, doesn't really matter when it comes to identifying what might be a significant sign for your clients and what to do if you're called upon to actually intervene. With that said, since 2017, what we found is that this group that we've targeted, the coaches, are not so much doing the interventions, but they're called upon by their clients, corporations, human resources departments, employee assistance programs, as well as, private individuals for help. My daughter, my niece, my neighbor is in great need here. I need some quick advice on what to do. For example, I gave a presentation in Ireland to a human resources group several years ago, and one of the participants, got my PowerPoint, and I will make this PowerPoint available to you. And he had a client in California, and on a Sunday afternoon, the client called him and said, "My sister is here. She's suicidal. What can I do?" And he didn't know who to call. It was probably a better way to handle this than just pull up my PowerPoint presentation. He said, "I'll call you back in 15 minutes. He pulled up this PowerPoint, walked her through it on the phone, and the sister survived. So, it's our experience that most of what we're doing today is what you will need to help other people help other people. Okay. I'm just checking the chat. Did we have any questions? Or you can come off of mute if you'd prefer to ask them auditorily here to begin with.
We're good to go. Thank you, Michael.
Good to go. Okay. I'm not really a big fan of PowerPoint presentations anymore. I've been doing them for 20 years, but I find for this particular, event where we're trying to learn, some of the things are just better shown in especially the statistics. So I'm going to share screen. Let's go with that one. And you should be able to see my screen. Someone gives me a thumbs up so that I can get a confirmation there. And we'll start off with the statistics from Europe. Now, Europe is much more difficult to find information, particularly England. In England, it's a practice, which I don't understand, to not record these type of statistics until 18 months after the fact. So, the best that we can do are 2019, because, only in 2021 were we able to start gathering a lot of the statistics from England. You'll notice also that this 100,000 has become a benchmark. With COVID, we're all pretty much familiar with how many cases per 100,000 in an area. So this type of universal way of communicating the impact is 11.34 in Europe. Men suicided, it's a verb. You can say someone suicided yesterday. It's actually a correct verb. 4.5 times more than that of women in Europe. The rest of the statistics I'll be giving you are generally from the United States. You'll notice that the European ratio of men to women is actually higher than the United States. It's the only one, that statistic, that's higher. 5,691 suicide deaths in England. Again, very difficult to get statistics for the United Kingdom. 1 to 20 completions to attempts. That means that one person actually succeeds, again, pardon the vocabulary, but that's what we use, in suiciding out of 20 attempts. We'll talk about teenagers here in a minute. But in general, it's correct to say that if somebody attempts a suicide, it profoundly affects 18 people. If someone completes a suicide, it profoundly affects about 34 people. when I say profoundly, it means it disrupts their mental capacity for a significant period of time. Oh, that's interesting. Succeed, completed, suicide. Yes, that's a word that we use as well. To complete a suicide or to attempt a suicide is probably the most politically correct. Hanging is used 54% of the time by the male population in Europe, which is the dominant form. The next dominant form in Europe is poisoning at about 9%. Male and 6% female, 35. So, that's kind of an overview of Europe. I'm going to move to the United States unless someone has a question about Europe specifically. We say that, in general, the statistics are pretty much the same worldwide. Can you identify a group that is particularly susceptible to suicide? The answer is really no, except for American white males. And I'll show you some statistics in just a moment here that show that, the older you get, the more likely you are to complete a suicide. So you can see that the rate is higher than that of Europe. The men to female ratio is a little bit lower. And firearms, in other words, guns, are used in half the time as being the dominant one. And then, poisoning, including carbon monoxide poisoning, basically people running their cars in a sealed garage being common. So again, here too, I apologize for some of the matter-of-factness that I'm reporting these statistics, because they all are very tragic and very meaningful when we look at them, on an individual basis. But just to give you a picture of what's going on. So in this, I'm moving very fast because I don't want to spend a lot of time on statistics, but if you do have a question, please raise it here. So suicidal behaviors, you can see in this chart, and I know it's hard to read here, that 12 million people thought about suicide. And then the middle circle, 3.5 million planned the suicide and 1.4 attempted. That's kind of that 1 to 20 ratio that we were talking about here. So when it comes to ideation versus implementation, there's a strong ratio difference. And where you catch the person along the spectrum of how they are moving towards an actual attempt will make a huge difference in the preventability of the suicide attempt. So again, here too, just some statistics, and I'm moving through these very quickly. Here, you see male and female in the United States, with firearms being, the bigger part among the males. This is increasing significantly among females in the United States. That's probably the highest rise, is that females are going from poisoning to firearms. So again, it becomes a very strong gun issue, something that I'm very passionate about here. But this is the next slide is the one that I really wanted you to take a look at here. You can see that the AI, the American Indian, rate out of 100,000 is much, much higher among males. The white population, Asians, Hispanic, but look at this number for the Black population and the Hispanic among females. I've given this presentation, to hundreds of groups around the world. And I'm always asked, why is the number for Black females, especially in the age group of 18 to 28, is exceedingly, it's one of the lowest in the world. And I don't have an answer to that, but in so many of the presentations, there's always been an African-American female on the call, and she just comes on on the line. It says, it's because we make them tough. It's because we're trained to be tough here. You know, we have to raise our kids and we don't have any help to do it. And, you know, and suicide's not an option. And I'm like, okay, this is an attitude I think that maybe we can all learn from. So in this next slide, I want to show you something that I find completely alarming here. In the age group of males above 75 years old, it's extremely high. And so what we have in the United States is a man who served in the military, who has a gun, who knows how to use it, who's recently lost his wife, has a 1 out of 2 likelihood of completing a suicide versus 1 out of 20 in Europe in general. Teens are probably the most researched group. They have a very low rate of completions. It's more like, depending on which group you're studying, I've seen groups that the best is 1 out of 200 and the worst is between 1 out of 200 and 1 out of 400. In other words, completions among teenagers is very, very, very low. It gets the most media attention, as it probably should. Let me show you this next slide about teenage females being up 51%. Well, this is a 51% of actually a very low number, but still very alarming that during COVID, the rate increased. So one more COVID slide, I think is very interesting. Again, young adults, ideation on the left side went up from 10 to 25% during COVID, but completions went down in all categories. All across the world, completions of suicide went down during COVID, with a couple of small statistically insignificant examples here. So you ask yourself, why is that? And a lot of research has been put into this. The speculation basically is during COVID, during lockdown, people were reaching out to each other in a more regular basis. There was more a sense of hunkering down and grouping together, what was this flocking? We just come together and we hunker down together and check with each other. So people calling their grandfather on a more regular basis during COVID than they did previous to COVID. And again, there are some demographic and geological exceptions to this, but that's basically my presentation on statistics. I will come off share screen because I don't like it and see if you have any reactions or any questions to what I've presented so far. What we're going to do next is talk about interventions, but I just wanted to check with you and how you're feeling right now. Question?
And that's one of the reasons why I said it doesn't have to be a very deep and dark, heavy subject tonight. We're all on here to help others because we're in the profession of coaching, and you add some humor to things, and you've shared this story about the statistics during COVID, which I found amazing the last time we talked, that people are connecting because they're not distracted by work. We're all like-minded, we're all locked down, and that actually just being able to talk to somebody had such a profound effect on the statistics. It's amazing. Thank you for sharing those. David had a question, and it was to do with the male suicide in the States. And he said, is that due to the ease of access to firearms?
Yes. Yes.
Mm.
Okay. In most places in the United States, it doesn't take very much to get a gun.
Mm.
You know, it's completely easy. And I lived in Europe, in Germany, for 23 years of my adult life. So I remember being in the official registration office there, and some guy was trying to get permission to, you know, buy a gun, and they wouldn't give it to him. And he was saying, where I come from, you know, it's a right that we have. And the German policeman just looked at him and said, not here. Sorry, walk away. You know, you have to prove your need to have a gun in Germany. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good policy. Okay.
That's right. I mean, when we were talking before this meeting, we talked about some famous people and quotes like Robin Williams. And, you know, the fact that you can't buy a gun easily takes away the immediacy of doing something spontaneous, doesn't it? It means that people have time to reflect and do other things rather than buy a gun.
Right.
So it's a good policy.
So
David said, although I think suicides in prisons have increased during COVID. What are your thoughts and research on that, Michael?
No comment. I don't know. I don't know that research. If David, you have anything to share with us, I don't know about that.
Yeah, no, Yvonne used to work predominantly, so like within the prison service, within Samaritans. So some of the statistics that generally tend to come through that we see, because during COVID, prisons were locked up more, they didn't have as many visitations, so therefore there was, you know, equally more pressure and stress, excuse me, placed upon them. That as far as we're aware, so like this, statistically, there have been more suicides in prison. Now, whether that would have happened anywhere is a question.
Although with the Samaritans, we used to go into the prisons and train up prisoners to become listeners. So they were on hand 24/7 to any prisoner who had suicidal thoughts. And because of COVID and the lockdowns, again, those listeners weren't able to mix in the mainstream because of lockdown and COVID. So the prisoners were left by themselves to cope with their own thoughts.
Well, you just touched on the best thing about a suicide intervention, the most useful thing. So how do you help someone who's suicidal? What you just said, listen. That's it. That's all you need. We're done. That's it. Listen is it. Now, how you listen and how you ask questions is what we're going to talk about in, you know, the next 30 minutes or so. And Dawn, is this a good time to announce the workshop on the, what is it, the 3rd of March, where you're...
Yeah, I was going to do that at the end.
Right.
Yeah, I've got it all written down.
Well, she'll give you the details at the end here, but I just want to cue up here that we're going to do a 3-hour workshop where you'll get to practice this, where you'll get to put this into breakout rooms and into, scenarios. We're going to go through case studies, as it nuances from one potential threat to another, what would be the difference in how you listen. But I just got an article from a friend of mine yesterday, because he knows that I'm, is it's kind of strange to have a hobby where you passionately research suicide all the time. You know, I don't know anyone else that does that besides me, but I am quite passionate about everything related to the prevention of suicide. And he sent me this article where this father with two daughters, they were headed to a basketball game, came across a bridge, and somebody was on the other side of the fence getting ready to jump. And he just stood there and said, "I'm here to help you. And I'd like to give you a hug. And when you're ready, I'll give you a hug." That's all the father could think about to do. And after many minutes, and the daughters had already called the emergency services, they were on their way. But by the time the police had arrived, the man came across the fence and got his hug. And that was all that was done. But it took several minutes for him to crawl back over the fence and get a hug. And I can show you a picture, I don't have it ready, of a very similar thing on a pedestrian bridge in north of London, where people did something very similar. Basically, the passengers coming across the bridge held on to a person until the person could be extracted by emergency services. All they did was hold on. Okay, so this is from the QPR Institute question, persuade, refer, which I'll refer to in more detail later here. They're saying that there's a wall of resistance. Paul Quinnett says these are the things in his 40 years of suicide prevention that keep someone from attempting a suicide. You know, good health, sobriety, in other words, good mental fitness, a sense of hope, you know, safety, very people that have a strong religious community. And if the theology of that religious community says that suicide is a bad thing, that actually works positively, but I'm a little cautious on that because sometimes, you know, it can become a stigma. Like I mentioned, as it was in Ireland until 1994. Pets, you know, I was talking to someone who the key to her staying alive at that point was her cat, you know, best friends and family. So I'll tell you a quick story here. I got a phone call. I was eating lunch with my son. And, you know, I picked up the phone and I said to my son, suicide. My son rolled his eyes because I was visiting him and we had a big, you know, afternoon planned. He thought I was going to be talking for the next 3 hours. Well, I only talked about 13 minutes. But in those 13 minutes, I was talking to this guy and I said, who is going to miss you if you go through with this? And he said, my nephew. Well, what about your nephew makes this an important, you know, connection for you? And he had a wife and he had a son and he had jobs and he had, you know, a church and he had all kinds of connections, but it was his nephew. And he said, well, my nephew and I go fishing every year and we don't catch much fish, but we spend about a week in a boat and we have a good time together. And I think he would really miss that if I'm gone. And that was the key for him to stay alive at that moment. And within 30 minutes, he was driving to the emergency department in our local community, and he gave you know, his pistol to you know, the friend of mine who made the initial call. And I could go on with stories like this all the time, but we have this wall of things that are preventing us. So, you know, what you're keying in here on this particular slide is those things that will, you know, enable the person to have a sense of this is why I should live. You know, right in the middle is a sense of hope. And I mention this one also with caution, because if a person is extremely depressed and you know, 2/3 of the time there is some level of depression in a suicide attempt, and 1/3 of a time and half of those, there's actually clinical depression. And if you emphasize hope, but one of the reasons why they are depressed is because there is no hope, they cannot sense hope. Now you're adding, fuel to the fire. So what all of this comes down to, with the exception of hope, is care. So if you have to err on the side of caution, you emphasize care over hope. So I've gone to the emergency department, at midnight on Saturday night, and someone says to me, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Because I care about you." And they said, "But you don't know me." And I said, "That doesn't matter. I care about you, and you're worth driving through a blizzard to get here." And everyone in the emergency department feels the same way, or they wouldn't have called me. So you've probably heard the nursery rhyme of Humpty Dumpty. He sat on this wall and he had a great fall. And we're going to look at how does suicide increase over time, because time and risk is actually, what you're working against. So there is a phase called contemplation, or, they're just thinking, they might not even think the word death or suicide, but they're just thinking it's just really bad. It's just really lousy. It's just really not what I want. And then the idea of ideation comes in. And we have often the question, maybe I shouldn't say suicide because I might add that to their idea structure. And before, they didn't think about suicide. So if I ask them about suicide, I am planting the seed, which is going to grow into an implementation. The statistics show that the mental posture for being suicidal is already there. And it's highly unlikely that they haven't already thought of suicide. So you asking about suicide is not planting the seed, it's confirming that they're thinking in this direction. So there's very strong evidence that asking about suicide does not create the ideation, it actually abates the ideation. So as time is moving on, they go into implementation. Now they're starting to, gather the things that it would take to hang themselves, or a gun, or poisoning. In developing countries, agricultural poisoning is the leading form of suicide. So, they begin to learn from, social media and websites, what people use and how to use that. Here, there's definitely an investigation going on towards, how would I actually go through with this? But all this while, that wall of resistance is there. And at some point in time, as time is moving on here, they breach that wall and they make their first attempt. Now, this is actually significant because if they have attempted, the wall for a future attempt is much smaller. The barriers to resistance are much less because they've already physically attempted a suicide. They've gone through that mental gymnastic to leap over the wall and actually attempt. So if they go to a repeat attempt, then the potentiality, that's correct, of it completing is much, much, much higher. So as we'll go through here in a summary in just a minute here, one of your primary questions is, have you attempted before? And if the answer is yes, then you will automatically consider this person to be a higher risk candidate. Because if they attempted did not complete, and now they're attempting again. They're much more determined to complete this time. Okay, so that's how it increases. Let's talk about how it decreases. So you have this wall of resistance, and a repeat attempt goes down. So you've probably heard that somebody in a suicidal attempt is sometimes locked down. And I've been in those situations, you know, where they've been in the watch room, where all the sharps are taken away, the mirrors are taken away where they can break the glass, the curtains are taken away where they can wrap themselves. So they're put into a very safe environment here. But how much time does it take before the brain calms down from determining to actually attempt again? Well, it goes down significantly, and notice on the bottom, 7 just appeared, and then 17, and then 37 and 77. Now, I came up with these numbers because, you know, it makes it easier for me to remember this. And what this is here to show you is that if I'm doing an intervention, or if I'm the key person that's, you know, working with this person, I'm going to check with them at 7, 17, 37, and 77 hours. Because, you know, they will potentially play the game to get released from the emergency department, walk out and complete another suicide and complete the suicide. That happens a lot.
Michael, when
Yes.
you were talking about the 7 and the 7,
Mm-hmm.
you might have had a slide that we couldn't see. I know you said you can see the 7s. I don't know if you meant to show us that slide.
It's at the bottom, the 7s. Are you not seeing that?
No, we've just, well, I can't. I can just see
I'm not
everybody.
sharing screen. I have all these
No, you
wonderful
stopped
graphics.
a while ago. Just so into your subject.
I've got all these wonderful slides. I forgot to share screen. I apologize. So I'm going to go through this really quick.
Thank you.
Mhm. So here you see the contemplation phase added to the ideation phase, to the implementation phase, to the wall, to the attempt, to a smaller wall, to a repeat attempt. And that goes over. A repeat attempt goes down. Now here you see it at the bottom, right? The 7 and the
Yes.
17 and the 37 and the 77. And like I said, I came up with these numbers just because it's easier for me to remember. 7, 17, so 37, 77, to check with the person 4 times in the next 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're not a therapist. You're not a counselor. We're not going there. I'm not training you how to bring the person to a mental wellness point. That is another topic that should probably be handled by a professional. We'll talk about that. Yet, you need to know that if you have been able to intervene, there's a level of trust that's been established. And if you can get back into that person's life 4 times in the next 3 days, you will notice their prefrontal lobe is going to unload. The limbic lock of it's all hopeless is going to loosen up. They're going to become more susceptible to positive suggestion than they were, right after the attempt. And there's also a very high likelihood that they were drunk to begin with, or on drugs, or both. And after 72 hours, that high, if you will, should have come down. Mm-hmm.
Michael, do I remember when you and I talked first that you said something around, if somebody has contemplated this is going to stay in their brain at some level for about 2 years?
Thank you.
Or am I making this up?
Nope, you're teeing up my next slide. Mm-hmm.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, so a repeat attempt over the long term. Notice the other one was short term. This is the long term. Is about the time in years is about 2 years. So if they have attempted in the last 2 years, 24 months or whatever, it's actually 27 months, according to one study, then they're automatically considered a risk of high suicide here. And look at this one. Any attempt in their lifetime makes them 40 times more likely to be successful in the future. So it never completely goes away, but it goes away significantly after 2 years or 27 months. And it never really goes away at all, because they have regarded this as a coping mechanism in the past. And now they need to know that you need to know that if they've tried coping this way in the past, they will consider it again.
Staggering.
Okay, so I want to move towards warning signs. The Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, a 15-hour course which I've taken, calls this invitations or balloons. So just look at this list. I'm going to touch on a few of these here. You know, they are indicating wanting to die. They are looking for ways to implement. They're feeling hopeless. They have an unbearable pain, and that pain might be physical or mental. And keyword unbearable. They don't feel that they can bear it anymore. They start using more drugs. They start behaving recklessly, sleep more, they sleep less, withdrawing themselves, showing rage, extreme mood swings. Basically, anytime you see a severe shift in someone's behavior, you ask yourself, what's going on? Now, a story that happened here in Colorado, and I just talked to the guy that told me the story last week. I recorded it so I can write it up as an article. He was telling the story of, he was doing some training, and he mentioned suicide, and he said, has anyone, recently experienced this? And someone raised their hand and said, yes, we here in this company just had somebody who was becoming very dysfunctional. She was, very depressed, and we in the human resources department were considering, actually letting her go because she wasn't able to perform her job. And just recently, a couple of months ago, she showed up on a Monday morning, all happy. And we were all thinking, wow, great to have you happy again. But I took her to lunch, just to really find out how she was doing. And the more she talked, the more I realized that, something was off. And I asked her, have you been contemplating suicide? She said, yes. And in the ensuing conversation, it came out that she was trying to figure out how to, take her own life, but couldn't figure out what to do with her 2 children, young teenage children. And she decided over the weekend that this coming Friday, why Friday, I don't know, but this coming Friday, she would take her life and the 2 children. And so she was immediately, put in a therapeutic environment. The 2 children were taken to protective care. She went into a 3-month, rehabilitation. She came back, and it's a happy ending story. And the part of the story that I liked most is the office, the company welcomed her back with open arms. And there was no stigma around her having done this. And actually very few people knew the details, but they knew that she had gone through some mental, health rehabilitation and welcomed her back several months later. So we look for these signs, that sudden shift. Someone said, there's something off here. Let's look at it. Okay. I am coming down the home stretch here, but I need to present 3 very critical things. They are showing clear intent. There is a plan, and there is a history. So what we want to do here is break that down into something that we at Coaching Suicide Awareness have put together to help you remember, what do I do when it is, a critical situation? How do I ask the right questions? So you ask them a question to assess their risk level. You persuade them to live and to get therapy, and you refer them to a therapist. You don't need to do the therapy. You just need to keep them alive, help them stay alive. And keep them alive is not a wrong expression. If you have to call law enforcement to keep them alive, here in the mountains of Colorado, I know stories where they call law enforcement and the sheriff shows up and he doesn't know what to do. So he tackles them and put handcuffs on them and takes them to jail for 72 hours. Well, that keeps them alive, because it's, in some languages, there is no word for suicide. It's called murder. It's called self-murder, So in many countries around the world, it's still regarded as an attempt of murder. So law enforcement can pretty much do anything they feel necessary. So there's an 800 number or similar alternative. In Europe, these numbers are much more harder to find. So I'm going to have to leave you to your own devices. I just, in the last slide, gave you a couple of resources here. You check with the person, make sure that they don't get abandoned. And that's what I talked about, the 77 hours. In the United States, we have these numbers. And in June of this year, we're going to have 988. We have 911, which you might be familiar with in the United States, and now we're going to have 988 as a dedicated line. It's being implemented all over the country right now as we speak. So I don't know the numbers in Europe. I know it's 112 for emergency services. In each country, there are different organizations. Somebody mentioned the Samaritans a minute ago. But I'm going to give you a list of questions here in the next couple of minutes. Direct or indirect, who can you talk to about this? These are the type of questions that will keep them thinking about living. And the research is very clear on this. The longer you talk to them, the less likely they are to attempt. So when I said at the beginning, the key is listening. If all you're doing is listening successfully, the longer you do that, the less likely they are to attempt. Third question, have you been getting support from a mental health professional? Are you, what are you looking forward to? It's largely held that suicides increase during Christmas. That's actually not true. They decrease during Christmas because people are looking forward to seeing their relatives, to the festivities, to coming out of isolation and being with people. Now, right after Christmas, when all of that goes away, that's a dangerous time. Springtime is actually a very dangerous time because they think, well, I've been depressed all winter because it's been winter. And when the flowers come out, I'll feel better. Well, when the flowers come out, they don't feel better. And they say, oh, well, it must not be the flowers, it must be me. So I just need to eliminate myself. Not a good question is, since you feel you have no hope, what will give you hope? Right? You know, like I said earlier here, that hope question, need to be sensitive to the amount of depression that's, you know, present. In the case that I was dealing with the guy in the pistol and his nephew, it was, you know, again, a hopeful situation here. He was actually not as depressed as he was despondent. Without going into the difference between the two, the sense that he would get to go fishing with his nephew again in the coming summer was what kept him alive. So here in this next slide, and coming down the home stretch, I give you a couple of resources. I'm not going to go over these in detail here, but there is an international place. And I want to sum up my talk with 3 things to remember, 3 things to take away and remember. Don't die. Please don't die. So when you're asking questions, ask about death, intent, and experience. Let's go through those individually. Please don't die. Are you thinking about suicide? And as a coach, you might learn that closed questions are bad. Well, here we're talking about finding information very quickly, because, you know, seconds or minutes could be critical. So are you thinking about suicide? Yes. Have you been contemplating death? Yes. Not a good question is, are you thinking about hurting yourself? I heard a story where one person said, no, I would never hurt myself. I just want to kill myself. Okay, I don't understand the mental gymnastics that creates that as an answer in their mind, but, you know, they're not wanting to hurt themselves. So we use closed-ended questions to establish, are you thinking of death? Intent, the next one. Do you have a plan? Time. And the next question, lethality, gun, hanging, poison, pills, you know, do they have a plan? The more extensive the plan is, the more likely they are to go through with it. And that's the next question. Are you serious? You know, to what degree are they really intending to go through with this? You're not seriously thinking of hurting yourself, are you? And it's like, I really don't have the time to deal with this right now. So you're just kind of joking, right? Esther, before I knew anything about this, they told us if the teenager says suicide, you always take it seriously. There's never a joke about suicide. We always take it seriously. And then finally, experience, we've already talked about. What is your experience with suicide? Have you attempted before? 2 years? And how did you cope with it then? Listen for evidence of care, friends, pastor, you know, hospital, rehab group. Who would you miss? Like I said, I would miss my nephew and fishing. My garden, you know, I've heard of tomatoes as being the key reason why one person in the end decided to live. Okay, great. You know, that's what you care about. Not a good question. Since you failed last time, what do you think is going to make the difference in being successful this time? Not a good question. So just in summary for my talk today, please don't die. Ask questions about death, intent, and experience.
Thank you, Michael.
And so, Dawn, I promised to finish with 5 minutes left. There you go.
Yeah, very, very well done. Thank you. And thank you for making that so enjoyable and taking away some of that fear of, you know, that it's not dangerous to use the suicide word. If you've got an intuition and you're thinking it, then, you know, say it, because it's not going to plant the idea in somebody's head. I know coaches have a lot of fear around asking certain questions for suggestive purposes. So that's reassuring. Thank you for that. Jennifer, you asked a question earlier in the call when we were looking at Michael's statistics about the unplanned attempts. Would you like to ask him directly what your question was?
Yeah, just the statistics, you split it up between planned attempts and unplanned attempts. So I'm guessing the planned are, like you said before, you know, do you have a plan? How do you carry out this plan? And I was just wondering what constituted an unplanned attempt. Is it almost like an opportune thing? And what's the time frame for an opportune thing?
Happens very rarely. An unplanned attempt, you know, it's there's just not
the statistics. It said there were 217,000 unplanned attempts out of the 1.2 million, or it was
right.
Something like that statistically anyway.
Okay, yeah, I know which one you're referring to. Unplanned attempts, there's a high degree of mental instability, and at the moment they just go ahead and do it. They just pick up a gun and there's just really very little ideation, very little this slide right here is the one you're referring to, if I'm not mistaken. Unplanned attempts.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't happen very often. Most people are very deliberate in their planning of a suicide, but sometimes not.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, just fired, heading home on the bridge and jump off. You know, there's a little ideation in that example.
Sorry, you broke up then. I missed what you'd said. Would you mind just repeating it for me?
They get fired from their job, they get sacked, they're driving home, they stop on a bridge, they jump off.
Okay, I understand, yeah.
Or the famous example, the stock market crashes and they jump out of a window. That actually never happened. There's no evidence that anyone ever jumped out of a window during the crash of the stock market in 1929.
Okay, thank you.
What about certain professions, Michael? I seem to remember reading some research to say that dentists are the profession that are most likely to be interested in suicide because of the chemicals they're breathing, and the people that they're dealing with every day, all day, are in pain and unhappy. What does your research show about something like that?
There's a lot of research that goes into very specific groups: teenagers, doctors, farmers, dentists, healthcare professionals in general, veterinarians, first responders. And it's all in the end a question of mental instability, but there's no clear group aside from men over 70 with guns who've just lost their wives that are more susceptible. All of them in the end, you know, ceteris paribus, when everything else is held equal, none of those demographics show anyone to be more susceptible because of their profession, geography, or even age, except for the old men. That I know of. You know, research done all the time. Yeah.
Right.
If I could ask a question as well. What about the ones that deceive you that everything is fine, and they make an attempt, but give you that perception that everything is fine, so you don't catch those signs? How can you navigate that?
You have people with very strong need for privacy, and they basically act and role play a healthy position here. And most people that I know that deal a lot with suicide, we've all been caught with someone that catches us. You know, everyone that's written a book on suicide says, I'm an expert on the topic and this happened. I didn't see it coming because somebody covered it so well. My point there is that this happens to all of us. You know, even the ones that are very aware of all the signs, we all miss this sooner or later. And we have somebody on our watch, if you will, that does take their life. With that said, it's a matter of communication, and it's a matter of regularly checking with somebody and saying, you know, for example, my son was going through a divorce, and I said, people that go through a divorce, you know, often think about suicide. He said, that's ridiculous. And the next morning at breakfast, he said, no, I was thinking about that. And I could see where you would go to a real dark place that could be suicidal during a divorce. Thank you for bringing that up. And if I get dark thoughts, I'm glad to know that I have someone I can talk to. But that's kind of the key to is how are you really doing? And having someone in your life that will really ask and really understand how you're really doing. And that's what's missing in so many people's lives, especially men, because they tend to be so closed with their emotional states. You know, that's why they complete 3 or 4 times more than women.
Okay, thank you for that, because it's quite interesting. I have come across where it's a male who's probably about 19, 20, who seems to hide, like make it very clear to everyone, I'm very happy, and is very attentive in everyone else's needs and making sure everyone else is happy, but obviously has attempted suicide.
My daughter is a professional diagnoser. She has a master's degree in psychology, and her job is to diagnose people. And she says, you can tell when someone's over happy.
Right.
But, you know, it took a lot of training for her to be able to identify that.
Yeah, it's amazing how good at deceiving they are. They seem to find that balance because over time they make mistakes. And I think they learn from the mistakes of over expressing happiness, so they seem to keep a balance and, you know, get away with hiding what they're really feeling.
What I like to ask people is, when you rest, after you have rested, do you feel refreshed? I just put that on the table and see how they react. Because we all rest, but do you feel refreshed after you rest? Because I think for me, I'm not a psychiatrist, my daughter is. You know, to me, that's just a simple question of saying, like, no, I rest and I come out of my rest and I'm stressed again. Like, okay, so there's something there. What it is, I don't know, but there's something there.
I know I'm taking up the time, but I'm really curious. What if, like, for instance, a psychiatrist mostly they have to be on antidepressants to help their mood. So with antidepressants, sometimes you don't get a refreshed sleep. So that's also a way of hiding.
Right. But you bring up a great point here is if they're on antidepressants and they stop taking them, their potential for suicide ideation just goes through the roof.
Okay. So the antidepressants are really important. Okay.
Well, again, I'm not a mental health professional, but my understanding is that chemical imbalance is a cause for a lot of depression. I'm not going to put a number on it because I don't know. And the medication corrects that chemical imbalance. Not in all depressions, but in a lot of them. So the absence of that can cause havoc in the mind.
Yeah. Antidepressants don't give you that refreshed sleep either.
Yeah, I'm out of my league with that question. I can't answer it.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What, if any, other questions? Well, we've got Michael in the hot seat, and then I will explain a little bit about his course on the 3rd of March. Okay, so Michael and his team have founded a non-profit organization called Coaching Suicide Awareness. So we've had a taster today of Michael's style and delivery and expertise and passion for the subject. As he said, it's his hobby. What we'll be learning on the 3rd of March is how to become even more sensitive to some of the signs of somebody who may be considering self-harm. And it's a 3-hour course starting at 3 o'clock. It's all the threes, isn't it, Michael? The 3rd of March, 3-hour course at 3 p.m. And it's £97 for the certified workshop. So the information for the registration, which will be coming out again, was actually on the invitation and promo for today's call as well. If you can't find it anywhere, contact me or Ria and we will send it to you. And hopefully we'll see you on that call, and we'll together in breakout rooms learn a little bit more and have the opportunity to practice some of these questions and get comfortable with dealing with the subject. What, if anything, would you like to add to that, Michael, please?
My group meets tonight in 6 hours from now, which would probably be really late for most of you. But one of the reasons why we meet on a regular basis is because if we do an intervention, we need to debrief. If you do an intervention, you need to talk to someone, please. Don't just walk away from it and say, woo, thank goodness that person's still living here. Get into an environment where you can talk it through, because it will, well, I've done a lot of interventions, and, you know, those people that I find that have no one to talk to about it, they don't want to do it another intervention ever again. And those of us who can talk to someone, we want to do more interventions.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
You might need to do another intervention. Yeah, that's just, but your coaches, your trust people. People will come to you with intimate things like suicidal thoughts, and it would be unprofessional to walk away from that. That doesn't mean you have to fix it. You're not there. You're not a therapist.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of overlap between what you've been saying and the philosophy of being a coach as well. The questioning techniques, the listening, the not fixing, and so on. Personally, like David and Yvonne, I was trained by the Samaritans. I volunteered there for years, and their training is excellent. And I trained active listeners. So if there's an opportunity in your country or your area to have this volunteer training and give something back, it's very, very worthwhile. So on that note, thank you again, Michael. You can now be free to go and play in the snow with your dogs and do whatever you've got planned for the day. Lots of thank yous in the chat box, and very profound, excellent presentation, very practical and useful. Thank you. So very, very much appreciated. So everybody take care and stay safe. This is just one of many. You'll have seen that already. I know it's only mid-February, but already there's a slightly different theme to the masterclasses and webinars that we're holding at the IAPC&M. We're very, very committed to supporting positive mental health and well-being and giving you some tips and some practical tools. In fact, I'm going to say Teresa, but you pronounce it different.
Teresa.
Teresa is one of our speakers. I think you're something like the 9th of March, aren't you?
Yeah, something
7th
like
or 9th
that.
of March. So Teresa's going to be talking about grief. So this year we're very much concentrating on giving you the emotional tools and tips and techniques that you need, not only to look after your health, yourself, but also your clients, because as David is fond of saying, you know, please put on your oxygen mask first before you help somebody else. So that's one of our key focuses today. And I know Jenny Butter, who had a question for you earlier, Michael, she is our hostess with the mostest for the podcast, and she'd love to talk to you at some point as well. So keep networking, keep talking, and hopefully we'll see you again on the 3rd of March at 3 o'clock for a 3-hour session. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.